Welcome. My name is Robert Trent Benson. I'm the chair and director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies here at UVA. I'm very proud to welcome you to our wonderful opening Meet the Fellows event, which kicks off our yearly workshop schedule, which will begin next week. So this event is an event for you to literally meet the fellows. Our pre-doctoral fellows, our postdoctoral fellows, who are all doing work at the cutting edge of Black studies and several other disciplines. In fact, their work can be described as being beyond disciplines, cannot be disciplined by disciplines, because Black studies is really about humanity. It's an emancipatory project, it's a liberationist project, so it goes beyond narrow disciplines, which, after all, are often rooted in histories of slavery and colonialism. And so it's really beyond disciplines. That's the beauty of being here at the Woodson. Since 1981, the Woodson Fellows Program has earned international acclaim as a magnet for some of the world's best scholars in the humanities and social sciences, creating a collaborative, supportive, and multi-transdisciplinary, beyond disciplinary environment for innovative scholarship. As our longtime former director, Deborah McDowell, is very fond of saying, if you want to know where Black studies is going, find out who's at the Woodson, and you'll know. That applies to our fellows and, of course, our wonderful faculty. And some of the intellectual production of the 42-year history of our fellowship program can be seen here in these often prize-winning books here and here. And you will see more evidence of this in the fractures around this room and throughout the foyer and in the main office. We have a 43-year-old legacy that we're so proud of. We're so proud that over 190 scholars have come through this program since 1981. We're so proud that the 12 scholars you will see here, pre- and postdoctoral fellows, are part of this storied legacy and will make their own mark in academia and beyond. We are so proud to know that our pre- and postdoctoral scholars have accepted tenure-track positions and postdoctoral positions at colleges and universities across the nation, too many to mention here. We are so proud that just in the last 2 years, all of our 13 outgoing fellows have secured tenure-track jobs or postdoctoral fellowships at universities like NYU, the University of California, Irvine, University of Richmond, CUNY Graduate Center, UT Austin, Arizona State University, UC Santa Barbara, the University of Virginia, University of Illinois, Lafayette College, Texas Women's University, and St. Mary's College of Maryland. We note that because we know that the academic job market is depressing. And we are so proud that these young scholars come already ready to go. All the brain power, all the research skills. And it's our honor to provide a space for 2 years to provide resources and space and time. Such a valuable commodity, time, to do your best work and to be your best selves. That's the point of Black studies. We are just not any old discipline. And we are not just any old fellowship program that says, here's a carol and here's a computer, and we'll see you in 2 years. You will hear very shortly from these wonderful fellows. And I hope that in the 5-minute sample that you get of their work, you will be encouraged to learn more about their work. to know them across their time here at the university. I have more to read, but I don't want to read. Just want to talk. And then I want to get off the stage because it's about our fellows. But I do, before we turn it over to our wonderful post and pre-doctoral fellows, I want to first thank our founding director, Armstead Robinson, our second director, Reginald Butler, who are no longer with us, have transitioned, our interim directors, who really stepped in moments of crisis, Cynthia Holder-Fattan and Scott French, and our longtime former director, Deborah McDowell, because without that leadership, none of us would be here. I also want to thank Kevin Gaines, our Associate Director, the Woodson staff, Debbie Best, and Randy Swift, James Perla, for not only organizing this event, but for doing all the staffing work for the department and the institute, because we're two things. We're a research institute in which the fellows are central to, and we're also a department that has a curricular mission. So we're those two things, and those three staff members do a tremendous amount of work across both department and institute. And I also want to thank the wonderful scholars who are not in this room, but who are scholars from around the country, who gave of their time and their intellect to serve on the Woodson Fellowship Selection Committee that sifted through hundreds of applications to ultimately land on these fellows here. So if anybody wants to know, we have nothing to do with the selection process. It's all scholars elsewhere. So we will go in the order of the program that you have. It will be in alphabetical order. We do have one fellow who cannot be with us, Frances Bell, but you were able to read something of her project in the program. And those of you who were here last year might remember Frances Bell's presentation. So I will introduce our first fellow in alphabetical order, Malcolm Cameron, and then Malcolm will give a 5-minute presentation of his work and then introduce the next fellow, Jasper Connor, and so on and so on. And that will be our order. And then afterwards we will have wonderful food and drink. So it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Malcolm Cameron, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of History here at the University of Virginia. And Malcolm's project, as we'll hear very shortly, is titled The Bulldozer and the Movement, the Gadsden Freedom Struggle and the Age of Urban Renewal. Malcolm, the floor is yours.
Good evening. I'm Malcolm. Sorry. I'm Malcolm. I'm a PhD candidate in history here at the University of Virginia. And I'm also a first-year pre-doctoral fellow in the Woodson Institute. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to stand here and share. I'm also grateful for this fellowship. And before I begin, I just want to extend my sincere thanks to the Institute's leadership and staff for organizing today's event. So many Americans today live in neighborhoods segregated by race and income. The containment of often minority and low-income persons to certain neighborhoods is a key driver of inequalities like environmental harm. Across the country, groups have worked to mitigate these hazards and improve conditions in marginalized communities and increase housing access and affordability beyond them. A wealth of scholarship exists about the actions of private individuals and the federal government in spatializing race and driving inequality in the United States during the 20th century. Similarly, scholars have explored counter-organizers' challenges to these limited housing opportunities and environmental danger. However, many of these studies privilege the West Coast, Midwest, Northeast, and also large metropolitan areas. This despite the fact that the majority of Black Americans reside in the South, Things like public housing in the region rival other parts of the country, and most urban renewal programs took place in small to mid-sized cities. Through the case study of a mid-sized city in the Deep South, my work details racial spatialization and illuminates how Black Americans shaped and contested the built environment after World War II. My dissertation is titled The Bulldozer and the Movement, the Gaston Freedom Struggle in the Age of Urban Renewal. It argues that urban and environmental inequalities significantly informed Black activists and demonstrators' analyses and protests against Jim Crow injustices during the freedom struggle in Gaston, Alabama, at the time one of the state's largest cities and industrial centers. Popular narratives of the Southern freedom struggle often assert or usually foreground the struggle for civil rights and political rights and an end to segregation in public life as catalysts for organizing. Drawing on scholarship on labor and the movement, I assert that Black men and women and teenagers in Gaston also had vital material concerns, specifically ecological and spatial critiques of Jim Crow urban development. Following World War II, the city underwent significant and rapid development to make up for the dearth of construction made since the Great Depression. Professional planners and local elites sought to accommodate industry and respond to the housing needs of a growing influx of rural Black and white Southerners. The city widened and paved new roads, they constructed new bridges, they built new municipal buildings, they erected public housing, and undertook urban renewal, all part of an ambitious urban planning agenda. These post-war transformations forged a modernized Jim Crow through Black dispossession and residential segregation, subjecting many African American residents to significant environmental disadvantages. My work is shaped by my experience growing up as the son and grandson of women and men who experienced the struggle against Jim Crow. As a child, I did a lot of sitting and listening while they talked to me and each other about their experiences. Similarly, the bulldozer and the movement has required a lot of sitting and listening. It draws upon oral interviews, in addition to traditional archival research, and it also draws upon the frameworks offered by the emerging subfields of Black ecologies and Black geographies. But more than a recounting of discrimination and dispossession, my dissertation brings together studies of urban planning, public housing, urban renewal, the civil rights movement, and environmentalism to document Black life and struggle in Southern Appalachia, a region where the presence and experiences of Black residents are often overlooked. In the process, it challenges racist ideas about Black family life, illuminates Black Southern epistemologies, and reveals Black Southerners' communal visions. Further, shining a light on urban space, the environment, and the movement highlights the sagacity of Black Southerners and the capaciousness of their fight for personhood and full citizenship. Thank you. And so I'd like to now turn things over to Jasper Connor. He's a PhD candidate at William & Mary and a pre-doctoral fellow here at the Woodson.
Thank you all for coming. I just now realized how many people are here. That's great. I'm really excited to be a part of the Woodson Fellowship. I come from a program where it's not quite as rooted in Black studies, and so it's really exciting just to be in this space, this community where that's the center of the dialogue. So my dissertation is tentatively titled Twice a Problem, Black Disability in the Segregated South. And it explores the history of Black disability from Reconstruction through the desegregation of schools. And it largely looks at deaf, blind, and people with mobility impairments. And that's largely a product of my committee telling me, like, you can't actually go, it's got to have a definition at some point. My research spans so far 12 different state archives throughout the South. And I'm really excited to be here finally writing and getting into that work. When I started grad school, I had a civil rights project in mind, but right as I was applying to grad school, my daughter was born, and she's deaf. And so I put on my application that I was sort of also interested in maybe deaf history. And I started reading books on deaf history, and no one in this room will be surprised to know that there were very few black people in deaf history. Disability history, disability studies is an unsurprising lack of black studies and black history influence in it, and so that's sort of where my project went. So I kind of have two big things that my work is doing. One of them is looking at a structural overview of how institutional racism changes the way that disabled lives are lived. So much of the historiography around deaf history is about deaf schools, and they create these deaf spaces where deaf people sign and they form deaf community. And the first thing I discovered when I started looking into black deaf schools is that they're not black deaf schools. They're deaf and blind schools, and the kids live together, and many times they live in the same dorm. They become friends with each other. So I have an article where I explore these sort of ways that people make friendships, and the way that deaf and blind kids play ping pong together, the way blind kids learn to sign so they can talk with their friends. And this isn't something you see at the white schools. And it's a product of institutional underfunding over decades of time, right? It's a product of a poorly funded school system and a poorly funded structure throughout the South. But what it produces is a different way that disability is lived and experienced. And from what I understand, it produces, as much, joy and excitement in these children's lives at these schools as anywhere else. It's a really interesting thing for me to engage in that. I also these spaces are also not spaces of just kids playing ping pong or stealing their teacher's car, which Ray Charles did, who was kicked out of his school for stealing the car with the help of a deaf boy who sat on the hood and banged on the left for a left turn and banged on the right for a right turn. They don't say that those kids were one of that Ray Charles knew sign language, or that the deaf boy could speak enough to communicate, but I'm not stealing the car with anyone. I can't at least arrange that communication with. So, my project is not just about those sort of moments of joy and stuff. These are also dark spaces where children live alone for 8, 9, 10, 12 months of the year without the supervision of any of their families. So this is also a project that gets into the sort of darker history of disability, which is frankly a history of neglect and abuse across the country, but has not been sort of, these spaces sort of look like, in white disability history, they look like spaces where people come together and find disability community, and I think they dwell a little bit less on the sort of darker moments. So the other big thing that my project looks at is that a lot of disability history is about what non-disabled people think about disabled people. And so I root my project in oral history that I've conducted with people who attended these residential schools, and really looking at the work that those people do when they leave school, to think about what does it mean to be a black disabled person in an ordinary circumstance. So Ray Charles aside, right, as a kid stealing his teacher's car, what does it mean to go to work every day, to work at a blind workshop where everyone else there is blind and where you're paid a sub-minimal wage, right? That's not supposed to do that. So, what does it mean to be not an exceptional person who's, traveling the state and teaching other people with disabilities, but to be just an ordinary person who has a 9-to-5 and is poor by virtue of systemic racism and systemic ableism. So my project tries to get into the depths of that, but as my phone alerted me, I have exceeded my time. So I'm really excited to be here though. And I'm also really excited to present to you Kelsey Moore. She's a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University, and her project is entitled "What the Dead Witness: Clearing Black Knowledges in Jim Crow, South Carolina."
So good evening, everyone. Let me give y'all time. My name is Kelsey Moore, and I'm a second-year predoctoral fellow here at the Woodson, and I'm a PhD candidate in the history department at Johns Hopkins. And before I begin, I would like to express my thanks for everyone for being here, to everyone for being here. And I would especially like to thank Drs. Benson, Dr. Gaines, Dr. McDowell, Dr. Andrew Carl, who was my first interlocutor, and the staff, Ms. Debbie Best, and Mr. Randy Smith, and all of the undergrads who make the Woodson run. So thank y'all. So today across the South, development threatens Black cemeteries. In places like St. Helena Island, South Carolina, and Mecklenburg County, Virginia, Southern developers and tech behemoth Microsoft, for example, knowingly and negligently bulldoze these culturally significant sites for golf courses, resorts, gated communities, and data centers. Although countless historical, cultural, and anthropological works in Africana studies reveal the centrality of mortuary customs and the ways enslaved Africans and their descendants understood life and living, histories of development in the U.S. South fail to contend with the stakes of ritualized removals of cemeteries and other sites of Black and Indigenous ancestral memory and cultural practices. My dissertation, What the Dead Witness, Clearing Black Knowledges in Jim Crow, South Carolina, 1938 to 1942, historicizes this urgent moment, answering the essential question: how did removing the dead, the living, and the land become the standardized practice for redevelopment in the 20th century and beyond? Through a close examination of the Santee Cooper Hydroelectric and Navigation Project in South Carolina, What the Dead Witness argues that New Deal rural development projects functions as sites of spiritual, ecological, and epistemic violence against Black and Indigenous peoples. Whereas many studies of the New Deal in the South focus on the economic cost of rural development, my dissertation centers Black religious practices embraced by rural Southerners and their descendants facing ongoing premature death, environmental harm, and communal disruption. Although the official timeline of the project only spanned 4 years, the agency drastically transformed the base's natural, cultural, and discursive landscape. The authority surveyed, acquired, and cleared over 175,000 acres of land, but perhaps the most incomprehensible part of the project required the removal and flooding of over 8,000 graves belonging to enslaved Africans and their descendants, and the removal and flooding of human and non-human remains found in multiple indigenous burial mounds. By mapping the disturbance of cemeteries, burial grounds, limestone springs, and swamps, What the Dead Witness demands a Black eco-religious lens that reveals the mythic desires of white developers to impose their will wishfully on an intractable landscape. To do so, my dissertation necessarily brings conjure, an understudied African traditional religion woven throughout the cultural fabric in the Black U.S. South, to the forefront. Although Black South Carolinians in my research did not nominally claim conjure as their religion, their ideas about and relation to the land, the living, and each other reflected an orientation towards this robust lifeway. I use this framework to encompass the rich spiritual world of Black residents whose ways of being, living, dying, and caring for the dead were impacted by development. By relying on conjure as my theoretical and methodological foundation, I conclude that religion and culture are critical to understanding the violent states of development. In addition to making critical interventions in the histories of the New Deal, U.S. South, African American religions, and the afterlives of plantation slavery, my research reflects my desire to think differently about Black Southern history and culture to inform our politics. As the idea that the South and Black Southerners are underdeveloped and backwards continue to permeate our cultural and social fabric, it obscures our ability to grasp the violence that Black people and other colonized people in the South face through climate breakdown, voter suppression, and the destruction of land. Taking heed of the impetus in Black studies to challenge ways of knowing and being, I understand the Santee Cooper story as one that highlights the political consequences of failing to break epistemic modes. And thank you. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our next pre-doctoral fellow, Jamila Morris, who comes to us from the Department of Anthropology at Stanford University. Thank you.
Woodson for having me. As somebody that's coming from Stanford, it's nice to be in a safe haven for Black study. As Kelsey said, my name is Jamila Imani Morris. I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology from Stanford. The current title, and I really mean current as in today, because it changes, my dissertation is Contesting Columbia's Paradise, Youth Violence, and the Struggle for Black Life Across Generations. I'll begin. Máximo, the main character in the 1967 novel Champapú, Coral de los Negros, Champapú, Black Slum, by Afro-Colombian writer Manuel Zapata Oliveira, called on his fellow neighbors to rise against displacement from a predominantly Black urban neighborhood. While city officials use discourses of poor hygiene and sewers to rationalize the militarized displacements, Máximo clarified the anti-Black logics that organized this oncoming disaster. Connecting urban displacement to Cartagena's emergence as Colombia's paradise, he claimed, quote, "We will not let ourselves be expelled from Champapú. They will never change the Black face of Cartagena," unquote. The articulation of slum clearance as an effort to whiten the city was quite radical at a moment when talking about race at all was frowned upon, and it still is, especially because of municipal, national, and indeed social science scholarly efforts to brand Cartagena as a geography of exception, one wherein the racial conflict, violence, and displacement of the armed conflict presumed to be present only in the rest of the country has no place in this present premier tourist destination, which is known for its gorgeous beaches, colonial architecture from being the first major slave port in South America, and as part of what my brilliant colleague, Dr. Amber Henry, studies, commodify representations of women from the historic Maroon community, San Basilio de Palenque. Indeed, Cartagena has been casted as a geography of paradise, one that is colonial, sexual, and racial all at the same time. Yet the emergency of anti-Black state violence that disproportionately targets young Black youth, as well as the intentional state abandonment of predominantly Black urban neighborhoods into economic peril, operates jointly with the enjoyment projected for visitors in this geography of paradise, exemplary of what anthropologist Krista Smith calls Afro-paradise. These contradictions raise urgent questions that are more than just being about who paradise is and can be for. Rather, in conversations with Black geographies, Black feminist anthropological scholarship on state violence and tourism, and Black studies theories on the concept of generations in historical time, my dissertation asks, how do we understand these frictions, particularly for neighborhoods seeking to stake claims to territory and paradise, when they are presumed to be both necessary to and a threat to paradise? What other sensorial frameworks beyond vision are central to the operationalization of paradise and Black citizenship otherwise? And more importantly, I would argue, is if we understand paradise as this dialectic relationship between enjoyment and gratuitous violence of Black bodies, what sorts of political desires for Black life and living can emerge from such a place? I ask these questions alongside the following neighborhood-based and Black youth political organizing groups fighting for racial justice, livable infrastructure, and the end to gendered racialized policing in Cartagena. It's also inspired by my own upbringing in Washington, D.C., a city many known to be embattled in problems of gentrification, but also in this long-term battle of what it means to feel and belong in a place that constantly not only wipes you out, but uses your wiping out and uses your existence for its own profit and progress. Based on ethnographic and collaborative archival research with these groups since 2018, my dissertation examines paradise as more than just a place, but as a terrain of political struggle and of Black subjugation against which Afro-Cartageneros have struggled for generations. I probe this project of paradise, which is for me inclusive of the circulation of global capital, the securitization of public space, intentional state abandonment, and the reiterating gender, racial, and class hierarchies, in relation to the desire for presence, which I'll gloss as having enough, dignity, mobility, and territory. My dissertation considers the different strategies Black communities mobilize in order to make legible their presence and territory, and state-sponsored efforts to interdict those declarations in ways that offer other frames beyond vision and visibility for assessing the status and social life of Black citizenship in Latin America, especially since presence is never simply a question of visibility or invisibility. In this sense, I turn to the emergent politics of something like noise as a way not only to contend with what is at stake in efforts to declare Black presence, but to examine how discourses of noise are mobilized in order to produce racial Blackness and rationalize urban displacement, all while also being central to forging a Black sense of place. By probing this relation between paradise and presence within a geography for which the everyday violence of policing and the criminalization of what I call Black infrastructural weight-making are not typically seen as part of the global phenomenon of anti-Black racism, it seeks to contribute to a conversation in which violence is not just this instantaneous thing, but is instead palimpsestual, beyond the individual body scale, and beyond the singular moment of violence's extraction. Doing so challenges frameworks that seize the temporal and spatial effects of the suffering of anti-Black state violence as relatively noble, as this knowability presumes not only transparency and the ability to see it, but also assumes speed and linearity. In doing so, I developed Generations as an analytic for exploring the temporal stakes of this relation between paradise and Black presence. First, as a phenomenon of tourism geography's lingering and deleterious effect on Black communities, which is catalyzed by the development of enduring legal territorial categories of invasion and their elaboration into racialized hierarchies of belonging and citizenship over time. And second, Generations as a phenomenon of Black community responses to violence and from inheriting incomplete political projects from prior generations. I developed Generations then as a framework for the examination of what I also call the politics of Black inheritance for younger Black activist generations contending with the palimpsestic violence of paradise, as much as it lays bare the tensions of representing and diagnosing the suffering of slow violence and the attendant and at times contradictory political desires for safety, for progress, and for belonging produced in these moments. So next, I am more than happy and excited to introduce Christelle Olakoy, who is a PhD candidate in African American Studies at Harvard University. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here and for coming to listen to us introducing our research project, and thank you to the Woodson for this opportunity. So my name is Christelle Olakoy. I'm a second-year pre-doctoral fellow in the African and African American Studies department at Harvard University. And my dissertation is also tentatively entitled Black Nocturnal, Ecologies of the Night in Lagos, in which I explore the historical and ongoing conditions that turn nighttime into a little and better terrain of life in Lagos via ethnographic, archival, and art-based research methods. So my object of study is nightlife, written really with a punctuation slash between night and life to problematize the easiness with which those two words usually come together, and to rupture a sense of familiarity. Nightlife here does not refer to entertainment taking place at night in the sense of a legacy of industrial capitalist time and its ideological demarcation of work and leisure, but instead draws attention to the ways in which an ongoing colonial urbanism forced Lagosians to draw their survival in hostile urban environments from certain nocturnal economies. And I'm also looking at how those nocturnal economies and forms of living and socialities have also been, dependent on nighttime, have also been marked as already criminal. So I'm really interested in, on one hand, that question of the criminalization of the night and nighttime, and on the other hand, this question of the relationship between nighttime and social reproduction, or nighttime and the category of life and living, highlighting in the process how the reproduction of the everyday is actually sustained by an avowed, constantly suppressed, but essential nocturnal underground. So my investigation of nightlife in colonial and contemporary Lagos looks at the often racialized and feminized surplus of meaning that animates imaginations of the night, examines the political economy of those imaginations and how they serve to generate forms of surplus value and extraction from the state, and explores the possibilities and freedom that every night residents still find in the night. Last year at the Woodson, I presented a chapter on criminalization, policing, and nighttime, entitled The Night Watch State. The chapter placed the 2020 EndSARS protests, which ended in a state-sanctioned massacre against police brutality, protest against police brutality in Nigeria, in the context of a long history of state anxieties and predation towards nighttime. The Night Watch state is a state not only imagined, but also encountered and primarily felt in its most brutal forms at night. I emphasize the continuities between pre-pandemic and pandemic forms of policing the night, giving a genealogy of not only the uniformed police, but also the myriad paramilitary task forces which operate at night in Lagos, as well as para-state, more or less formalized types of violence workers, including night watchmen, area boys, private security guards, and police impersonators. The curfew logic of gates, checkpoints, and raids, I argue, creates potentially lethal predatory spatial temporal enclaves which function as every night temporal fix for the contemporary state. Configuring its sovereignty at night around the divide between the settled and the errant, the domestic and the wayward past of ever-expanding categories of night workers, the Night Watch state ultimately forces Lagosians to inhabit the night only on borrowed time. This year, I'm working on a chapter that is more historical in nature, entitled Nocturnal Ecologies, which wrestles with the question of the nocturnal outdoors as a space of possibilities and a space of resistance for urban residents. In one of the most widely read newspapers, the West African Pilot, the editor in March 1938 states, "At night it is torturous to be confined within those black holes." And the black holes in question refer to the concrete and corrugated roofed habitations that became a hallmark of colonial housing in Lagos, slowly replacing vernacular mud and bamboo materials. Among other things in this chapter, I argue that the concrete ecologies of the colonial city encourage the household as a site of increased exposure at night due to the sedimented toxicities and debris from daytime, including but not limited to the heat, the toxic fumes, and the distribution of night soil. So in contrast with ideologies of domesticity which sought to restrict colonial subjects to the household at night, the unlivability of houses contributed to produce insurgent, queer epistemologies and uses of the night at odds with the law. I then explore the language of confinement and incarceration that sutures Black Africans' past and contemporary description of the household, the escape they seek in the nocturnal outdoors, and the ecologies of the night they inhabit while night walking, outdoor sleeping, wandering, all bunkering, resting, and assembling in the night. So after those few words about my project, it's my pleasure to introduce the next predoctoral fellow, Olivia Polk from Yale University.
Okay, we're gonna get the call and response right, I feel. Good evening.
Good evening.
Come on. Okay, so before I get started, I also just want to extend my thanks to the folks at the Woodson who make us being here together possible. So Randy, James, Miss Debbie, Kevin James, and you, Robert Vincent, who I'm learning is a master of a warm welcome. So thank you. And I also just want to say it is so, I'm coming here from Yale University, which, as some of our other fellows can attest, is a good and dynamic place, but it is a really exciting thing to be sitting here and hear so many presentations that I feel speak to just the concerns of my everyday life. And that's a great and rare thing. So, my dissertation, We Can Dream the Dark, Black Lesbianism and the Ethic of Black Queerness, analyzes the twin genealogies of Black feminism and Black queer studies, two distinct but interrelated fields that share one critical feature. Many of their foundational and most cited ideas have been authored by Black lesbians. My dissertation queries what about Black lesbianism has remained so theoretically compelling, yet so under-investigated on its own terms, and it begins with two questions. First, what has lesbianism as a standpoint that exceeds the category of womanhood contributed to Black feminism? And second, why were the works and lives of Black lesbian thinkers adopted as blueprints for Black gay men in the context of the early HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s, and later by Black trans and gender nonconforming femmes into the 21st century? In answer, I argue that since Barbara Smith presented toward a Black feminist criticism at the Modern Language Association in 1977, Black lesbians have experimented with critical and aesthetic forms in order to articulate an ethic, a theory and practice for living a good life. This ethic, which I term Black lesbianism in distinction from the particular figure of the Black lesbian, is conveyed in terms of a tendency toward coalition building, depathologizing embodied difference, and openly engaging with the contingencies of the past. Reading capaciously for practices of Black lesbianism in the archive of Black queer life teaches us concrete relational mechanisms for remaking our violent anti-Black world in ways that address key questions across academic fields, including American Studies, Black Studies, WGSS, regarding alternatives, particularly to racial capitalist structures that undergird our contemporary life. Because Black lesbianism is at its core a poetics of relation, it manifests as a navigation or redress to ethical scenes of reading, sex, change or transition, ecological sustainability, some themes in my chapters, in terms of culture or in the form of culture. Following Kevin Quashie, my research proposes that Black lesbians offer us a robust tradition that allows us to think about Black subjects as ethical subjects, even as we must acknowledge the fundamentally unethical constraints of an anti-Black world. And finally, by offering the frame of Black lesbianism as ethic, my work challenges the shared philosophical norm of Western post-Enlightenment and also certain strains of Afro-pessimist philosophy that emphasize ontology or being as the existential problem that overdetermines Black life in terms of anti-Black violence. Black lesbianism, in my frame, intervenes in this overdetermination by insisting upon relationality and collectivity as Black life's generative philosophical frame. So just in terms of a brief overview of my chapters, I trace the proliferation and intervention of Black lesbians' ethic through defining moments of Black, queer, and feminist political tension since 1977. So I began with a cultural historical account of receptions to Barbara Smith's interpretation of Sula as a lesbian novel, arguing that criticisms from prominent Black feminists that her argument was unrigorous, and the later transformations of those arguments with time point to the foundational disruptions that the Black lesbian position has posed for both respectability as a politics of Black life and disciplinarity as a practice of engaging with Black knowledge making. And this is precisely because Smith's essay began with the proposition that Black feminism ought to offer an instruction for ways of living and dreaming. Next, I take up sex as a scene for experimenting with political ethics, and I do this through a comparative account of Black lesbian feminist sexuality and the Black gay men who identified with Black lesbian social ethos and writerly forms. So chapter 2 of my dissertation, which I plan to present at this year's workshop, analyzes Audre Lorde's unpublished journals, where she worked through ideas that would become the famous essays like Uses of the Erotic, her published poems, and also her lesser-known criticisms of lesbian BDSM culture, and also her own public dysfunctions navigating non-monogamy and not always consensual non-monogamy in her partnership with Frances Clayton. And so I discussed these works alongside the archival writings of a lesser-known Black gay short story writer and scholar, Gary Fisher. Fisher's posthumously published journals relate his identification with an anti-racist literary tradition of Black feminism, alongside his graphic depictions of his practices of interracial cruising, BDSM, and living with long-term illness from age-related complications. And so through a comparative analysis of Lord and Fisher's shared sense that their politicization emerged from a love and identification with Black women, I try to think through how kinky Black queer sex places pressure on a certain common sense about what constitutes an ethic of Black feminist sex. Chapter 3 considers the legacy of Black lesbianism in the context of the politics and aesthetics of Black trans life, particularly through Alexis DeVoe's new experimental work, Jesus Devil, The Parables, as well as tourmaline speculative filmmaking, and Black trans activist elder Beverly Glenn Copeland's dynamic soundscapes. And then finally, my dissertation ends with a consideration of an ecological ethics and how Black lesbianism might respond to this moment of climate crisis. And I do this through an analysis of Alexis Pauline Gumza's experimental prose poem, M. Archive, After the End of the World, and M. Jackie Alexander's 2005 monograph, Pedagogical Crossing, which I argue furnish a model of an eco-ethics that draws upon the ethos of Black lesbianism's plasticity as a strategic knowledge for living beyond the human, and its declining viability in relation to other forms of life on Earth. So that's my story, and I'd be glad to share it with you. Next, we have our final pre-doctoral fellow, Alexis Trouillot, who comes to us from the History Department of the University of Paris.
There are a lot of people. Hello, good morning. So my name is Alexis Trouillot. I'm a second year pre-doctoral fellow, even though I actually defended my PhD in last December. So my project is entitled Mathematics in the Deserts, Computing Text and Intellectual Authority in 19th Century Sahara. And this work focuses on mathematical manuscripts written in Arabic in West Africa, and specifically in the west of the Sahara in the 19th century. So this work was born when I was a master's student in mathematics, and was made aware that there were a big volume of manuscripts written in Arabic in West Africa. Now, a small volume of these manuscripts were about mathematics, and my goal became to read these manuscripts to be able to produce an history of mathematics that would center Africa, which is something that has not yet really been done, despite the work of scholars like Claudia Zaslavsky or Kuzgats. So the aim of my work is to take these manuscripts about mathematics as serious historical sources and see them as pieces that produce a discourse or a series of discourses on numbers and on calculations in the region. So my main questions can be summarized as follows. In the 19th century Saharan West, how can we talk about calculation? So questions of numeracy, how number are taught, how number are used, and how they are represented. So very concretely, how are they written and where are they written? How do we calculate? So reading treatises that are about mathematics and calculation to know how to do the 4 basic operations, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, but also more complex operations like extraction of square roots, calculating fractions. And finally, what are the fields of application of calculations? And I focus specifically on the field of inheritance sharing in Islam as the main outlet for this notion of calculations. My objective is mainly to encompass the method and tools that are used for a discipline that is called Hisab in Arabic, and that could be roughly translated as arithmetic. And during my PhD program, I mainly focused on the library of one particular scholar from Mauritania called Sidi Al-Kabir, and his own practical application of these notions in inheritance texts. For example, last year at the Woodson workshop, I analyzed a fatwa by Sidi Al-Kabir that look at the division of inheritance, what to do to divide an inheritance where an intersex person is involved, and he uses this figure of the intersex to create mathematical problems, as you have to consider that this person is a man and a woman at the same time, and then calculate means. So in the conclusion of my PhD, I showed that calculations were carried out in a multiple but different way, and that it was presented in a different way depending on the context. And for example, the use of numerals were actually vanishingly rare outside of texts that are explaining how to calculate. In texts that actually calculate, the numerals are mostly absent. Now this year at the Woodson, what I would like to do is analyze mainly magic squares that are mathematical artifacts that are used as talismans in the region. You can think of them as Sudoku grid, so something where made a table where if you add the lines, each lines together, each diagonal together, you get the same number. And they are used by scholars in the region as scholars in the region produce these talismans and then sell them. And I want to analyze the way different numbers are represented in these magic squares, since sometimes numerals are used, sometimes a correspondence between the different name of gods and numerals and numbers are used, sometimes an alphanumeral system is used. So I want to analyze the ways the numbers are represented in these artifacts. I also want to see them as a way to transfer mathematical knowledge into economic capital via the science of the unseen, so magic. I think that's going to be it for me, but before presenting the first postdoctoral fellow, I'm also co-organizer of the African Study Colloquium of the Woodson with Christelle Olukoy. The full program should be circulated soon, I think, Robert?
Yes.
But our first date is October 25th, and we're going to have a talk by Rudo Modiwa on policing in Zimbabwe, and be happy to see all of you. So now I welcome Anna Dunsing that got her PhD from Yale, and whose project is called Fascism is Already There, Civil Rights and the Making of a Black Anti-Fascist Tradition.
Good evening, everyone. There is a lot of people here. Hi, everyone. As you heard, my name is Anna Dunsing. I'm a second-year postdoctoral fellow here at the Woodson, and I received my PhD in 2022 in History and African American Studies from Yale. Just to kind of set things up and then focus more on the book project. Writ large, I think of my work, I think of myself as I'm a historian of the United States and the world, of moving in that current of US and the world that's looking at black radicalism and grassroots diplomacy as a way to really subvert the cannons and trumpets model that I think a lot of people associate with that field. And then within that, my research is rooted in African American history, transnational social movements, and the evolving global politics of white supremacy across the 20th century and into the 21st century. And something I'm also empowering myself to talk about more as well, I'm also really passionate about public history, and I've worked in museum education and curation and radio broadcasting and podcasting and documentary studies for about a decade. And for various reasons, I'm reflecting on that of late and realizing how much a public history career and ethos really shapes my academic research. And I think what really joins them is one, just a commitment to transnational social history, but I think equally so, whenever possible, taking up the generative rejoinders that Black studies brings to traditional history approaches. So here at the Woodson, my primary focus has been my book manuscript, which last year felt really weird to call a book manuscript, but this year feels a little easier. So as you heard, it's called Fascism is Already Here, which is a reference to a George Jackson quote. The subtext, Civil Rights and the Making of a Black Anti-Fascist Tradition. The book bridges social, political, and intellectual history, Black political thought, historical memory studies, and scholarship on the modern US right. And in essence, it's following Black activists, artists, intellectuals, World War II veterans, and really panning out to look at their multiracial coalitions from the really beginning with murmurs in the 1920s, but picking up in the 1930s and reading that history through the 1970s with a little coda in the 1990s. And what I'm doing with the work is mapping a long arc of Black anti-fascist thought and grassroots organizing, essentially on top of a long civil rights movement framework. But I think something I really realized in the last year is how much I'm thinking about anti-fascism and fascism as co-constituted politics. So the idea is, right, using anti-fascism to better understand and scrutinize, right, this kind of murky boogeyman and specter of fascism, I think especially in the United States, but more generally beyond the geographic and chronological boundaries of interwar Europe. And I think in that relational way, sort of thinking about the project relationally, my primary goal with the book is to expand our knowledge about Black radicalism, Black political thought, anti-fascism, and the Black freedom movement. But I really am also trying to write a book, a history of anti-fascism that's also a history of fascism. And in particular, taking up, so Cedric Robinson offered this kind of very critical observation, the extent to which dominant historiography had paid what he called a general inattention to Black constructions of fascism, as well as Black anti-fascist political mobilizations across the 20th century. So a bit of how I'm structuring the book, I'm thinking about it really as a story of continuity and evolution, really beginning in the robust, very kind of popular vernacular Black anti-fascism of the interwar and wartime years, in which this was this possibility where anti-fascism could even have a patriotic resonance in the context of the war. But in that era, its critical attention is of Jim Crow as a kind of homegrown fascism, what was often called Hitlerism or native fascism in the context of the United States. But what's really important for me is to read that legacy sort of through the break of 1945, through the chill of the Black and Red scares, and then into the age of Black power, where you see a kind of revival of sorts, right? A tradition that was somewhat diffuse in the context of Cold War political oppression becomes revived again, but sort of shifts its focus to look at these kind of entangled prison and military industrial complexes and the kind of false promise of reform as a kind of veneer of civil rights liberalism. And the main reason really embracing the kind of social history framework, the way I'm telling the story of continuity is by following people whose lives span those eras. So some are really well-known figures like Claudia Jones or W.E.B. Du Bois or Paul and Islanda Robeson, George Padmore, Robert F. Williams, and then of course, I think the most iconic Angela Davis and George Jackson. But what's really important to me is to take other figures who are known kind of in one particular context and really bringing them to the fore. So some of the other figures who I think really form the backbone of the project. Probably my most beloved, this radical political satirist named Ollie Harrington, who had the longest running political cartoon in the Black press for decades. I'm also following the communist organizer and journalist John Pittman. And then last but not least, a lot of my more recent research has been about the revolutionary pacifist and civil rights lawyer Conrad Lynn. And pulling back from individuals, I am doing a lot of network mapping with organizations. So looking at kind of explicitly civil rights or labor rights groups, and then doing a lot of like literal like pins on the board with strings in between with explicitly anti-fascist organizations. So a great example, I was just telling Olivia, next week I'm going to be at the Schomburg in New York, because I saw in some mention in the Civil Rights Congress papers a group in the 1940s, a black-led group in the 1940s called the Kill the Klan Committee. And I was like, I gotta see what that's about. But just recognizing the extent to which names are appearing on different letterheads, and a lot of figures who we've never thought about as having an anti-fascist politics before really did, often like in a very full-throated and robust way. And I think despite this change over time story, as us historians are often obliged to take up, what I am ultimately arguing is that this current of black anti-fascism, although it evolved over time, it was rooted in a really consistent conviction that fascism and democracy were not opposing political systems, but there was something much murkier there that, most importantly, although it may not be defined all the time, it necessitates watchfulness. So I want to close by offering my gratitude. Thank you all so much. And this community is just unparalleled. It's been really special, and I'm so happy to have new folks coming in. So with that, I say thank you, and I'm very happy to introduce my colleague, and fellow postdoc, João Batista Nascimento Gregoire. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I must say it feels really exciting being here in this new position for me as a postdoc fellow, because although I'm a first year postdoctoral fellow, some of you might have seen me around. I was a pre-doctoral fellow in the past 2 years, so this is my third year at this great institution. And my research focuses on Afro-Brazilian activism and demands for political representation and inclusion over the 20th and 21st centuries. I'm writing a book entitled For a True Democracy, Black Politics in Brazil Under the Military Dictatorship, which is based on my doctoral dissertation. In the manuscript, I analyze the evolution of the Brazilian Black movement into a political force that reshaped broader political discourses and actions, leading to the restoration of civil liberties that ultimately contributed to the end of the Brazilian military regime in the 1980s. My manuscript will advance a significant understanding of racial politics in Latin America. The literature on Brazil's transition from military rule has focused on the role of the labor union, women's and student movements, opposition from key sectors of the economic elite, leftist groups, and the Catholic Church as the social actors calling for the end of authoritarianism. By incorporating the Black movement within this universe of civil society groups, my manuscript revisits traditional explanations of the democratic transition. These interpretations have minimized the significance of race and ethnicity, instead emphasizing social class-based explanations for political change. My work argues that the Brazilian Black movement epitomized broad political calls for representative democracy and participatory society that gained significant traction in public forums in the 1980s. This was a singular moment in Brazil when Brazilian nationals enthusiastically debated ideas of nationhood, citizenship, and identity. My work sheds light on the transnational connections between Afro-Brazilian activists and international nuclei of Black activism in their struggles for political representation. The military's repression of open protest and collective mobilization impelled the Brazilian Black movement to search for an identity that transcended national barriers. The African-American Black Power movement's ideologies of self-determination and Black nationalism, as well as African liberation struggles, resonated among the Black Brazilians. A group of politically conscious Afro-Brazilians came to understand their socioeconomic and political disenfranchisement as incongruous with celebrated ideas of racially inclusive nationalism that promoted false premises of equality between races. So this is just a brief overview of my project. I also want to take this opportunity here to say how excited I am for being back in the classroom. Next semester I'll be teaching a class here at the Woodson, and as pre-doctoral fellows, the Woodson provides us with this great opportunity of just spending 2 years on research, which for me was crucial because I became a parent of twins, and I had a kid already, so my life was crazy. And I don't think I would be able to finish my dissertation without the support of the Woodson. So I would be always grateful for the support that this institution gave me at this very challenging moment in my life. But now that things are somewhat more under control in my life, I'm so excited to be back to the classroom. I love teaching. I was a teacher before I became a grad student. And also I'm extremely excited about my workshop next week. I will be the first fellow to and I would say there are so many great things about this program, but for me the workshops are the highlight of this program. And this is going to be a little more special, I think, this year because it's going to be the first time that my interlocutor will be here in person. In the past 2 years, my interlocutors were present just remotely, and so Professor Juan Dixon from Harvard University, who does work on Afro-politics in Latin America, will be here, and I'm really look forward to hearing the comments of all the people attending the workshop. It's usually ours, not usually, generates some very interesting debates, so I really look forward to this moment. And now I'd like to introduce my dear friend who does superb work on Colombia, Amber Henry. She has a PhD in anthropology and African studies from the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the selection committee for selecting such a diverse and yet complementary cohort of fellows, and also Woodson faculty, students, staff, and fellows, and also to the leadership of Dr. Robert Trent Vincent. Robert, if time is a luxury, time at the Woodson is ambrosia. Throughout the Atlantic world, Maroons use tactics of evasion, elusion, and escape to refuse the yoke of slavery and establish autonomous communities as some of the earliest examples of Black sovereignty in the Americas. Today, descendants of these Maroons in places like Jamaica, Quilombos in Brazil, and Palenques in Colombia struggle against new threats of cultural commodification, displacement, and other forms of dispossession. My research then asks, how might these historical legacies of Maroonage shape the contours of racialized and gendered subject formation, as well as political mobilization in the present? To explore this question, I investigate grassroots activism and agentic modes of self-fashioning against women from the Maroon community of San Basilio de Palenque, which is an Afro-Colombian village of about 4,000 people located along the Caribbean coast of Colombia. Drawing from archival research, documentary film, and over a decade of engaged ethnographic work with Palenquera women street vendors in Palenque and Cartagena, I think about how Maroon status informs the way Palenqueras, who are encompassing a place that is at the intersection of Blackness and indigeneity, and I think that my mentor here, Jim Igo, engage in political action and mark their claims as being legible to the state. So in this photograph, for instance, I was accompanying a group of Palenquera women who were protesting harassment of women in the community. Here, one woman stands with her mouth agape as she clenches her fist around the flag. Mirroring her posture is Palenquero founder Bencos Piojo, who also stands with his hand raised. Bencos Piojo is the man from the Bight of Benin who is credited as escaping enslavement in Cartagena and helping to found Palenque as one of the first free black settlements in the Americas upon signing a treaty with the Spanish crown in 1703. Beside her, Maria holds the yellow, blue, and red stripes of the Colombian flag. So I pause on this photograph to show how Palenquera women draw from their status as Maroons to mobilize alongside and in times against the Colombian nation state. This is a practice steeped in traditions of self-determination, departure, and fugitivity. The image epitomizes the importance of collective mobilization, flight, and agentive forms of bodily movement for Palenquero politicization. During an informal conversation with Palenquero activist and educator Alfonso Cassiani, just about a month ago, he casually referred to this as cimarroneando, which loosely translates to marooning. Taken as a verb, marooning resists the tendency to treat maroonage as this kind of eventalization, in the names of Foucault, this kind of singular event, a historically bounded event conformed to the colonial and enslaved past. Instead, cimarroneando, or marooning, refers to these kind of ongoing processes through which African descendants navigate their uneven terrain of racial exclusion and extractive modes of cultural commodification, which, as my colleague Jamila Morris has already mentioned, in the city of Cartagena, often are taking place through the context of tourism. Marooning is an ideology of fugitivity, one that charts the pathway towards more liberatory futures by way of a body's movement through space. So building on the concept, this Palenquero concept of cimarroneando then, I developed a term in my book called fugitive self-making. This term is used to describe the myriad ways in which Palenquera women use tactics of evasion, opacity, and flight to chart alternative futures in a universe preponderantly shaped by slavery's material and immaterial afterlives. As fugitive subjects then, Palenquera women skillfully toe the line between visibility and opacity, engaging in strategic forms of cultural performance while grounding themselves in African-inspired spiritual traditions and linguistic forms that even while they are hyper-visible in, say, tourism, pamphlets, or murals, allows them to be slightly illegible and therefore not fully able to be captured. In this way, I investigate the political purchase of maroonage in the present to probe the contours of Black life in Colombia and to borrow my phrase from UVA professor and colleague Ashton Crowley, who I believe is here, otherwise worlds. I would now like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Micah Jones, who earned her PhD in African and African American Studies and History at Yale. Micah is a first-year postdoctoral fellow here at the Woodson, where she is working on a book manuscript entitled Jim Crow Prerogatives, Race and Consumption in the United States from 1890 to 1980. Thank you.
Hey y'all, so I want to begin by expressing how grateful I am to be here and to be a member of the Woodson community and to get to learn from and with all of you. And I'm excited to get to share a little bit of my work today as my project transitions from the end of its life as a dissertation to the beginning of its life as a monograph. So on November 16, 1935, a man named Dennis Redwine entered the A&P grocery store in Atlanta. Redwine, a middle-aged black man, picked up a bag of sugar and began to walk through the store. Edward Granger, a white store clerk, assumed that Redwine was stealing the sugar and began to beat him. This attack on Dennis Redwine was not an isolated incident. In the Jim Crow South, white workers in grocery stores regularly engaged in violence against black consumers. These attacks were just one aspect of a broader array of anti-Black incidents, norms, and procedures that define the experience of shopping while Black in the Jim Crow South. My project, tentatively titled The Price of Freedom, places the experiences of Black grocery shoppers like Dennis Redwine at the center of histories of consumption and the civil rights movement in the early to mid 20th century South. In the Jim Crow era, stores were unique sites of quotidian interracial encounter within a broader landscape of segregation. And as such, they were key sites of race-making, where Black and white Southerners contested and explored the meanings and implications of race. I consider how transformations in the grocery industry, such as the rise of chain stores like the A&P or the Piggly Wiggly, impacted Black shoppers. But I also examine how civil rights activists organized through and in the space of grocery stores. Activists sought to halt the violence and discrimination Black shoppers faced, but they also leveraged the role of consumer, a social position of growing social and political import in this era, to pursue racial equity beyond stores. Stores were a site in which calls for racial liberation, at times abstract, became something as concrete as the ability to buy a bag of sugar in peace. Activists sought to eradicate white supremacy in both its ordinary and its extraordinary guises. And over the course of the 20th century, Black Southerners pursued an expansive vision of freedom, stretching from the polling place to the produce aisle. I entered the world of the Jim Crow grocery store through two intensive periods of anti-racist consumer protest. The first took place in the Depression era, and it was the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work movement. Activists used boycotts to pressure white-owned stores to hire Black workers and to promote them. And historical accounts of this movement have tended to depict it as a labor movement concentrated in the urban North and Midwest. I explore the history of this movement in the Deep South and emphasize its investment in improving the experiences of Black consumers. For instance, Black residents of Atlanta's West Side boycotted the A&P and demanded the hiring of Black workers in the wake of the attack on Dennis Redwine. Black staff were seen as a form of protection for Black shoppers from further harassment and violence. But in response to advocacy from white supremacist groups, the A&P refused to hire Black workers in Atlanta, though they had begun to do so elsewhere in places like Chicago and New York. The A&P's decision produced new distinctions between the racial regimes of the North and the South. And the Atlanta A&P boycott of 1935 demonstrates how white Southerners adapted and reforged the racial regime of Jim Crow in response to challenges. Consumer boycotts returned to the fore of the civil rights movement in the late 1950s and 1960s. Black Southern consumers, like Arma Lee Hill of Jackson, Mississippi, continued to encounter racism in white-owned stores. In 1962, a white grocer named Wilburn Sanders shortchanged Hill, and when she objected, he attacked her. In response, activists called for a boycott, using the incident to make broader criticisms of the ways that white businessmen treated Black residents as workers and consumers. Activists in the 1960s, however, relied on different rhetorical and political strategies than their Depression-era predecessors. They framed the discrimination Black Southerners encountered in stores as anti-democratic in nature. Racial discrimination both compromised the United States' claims to be a democracy and relegated Black Americans to second-class citizenship. Black Southerners understood securing an equitable shopping experience as a prerequisite to and a path towards full citizenship. Broadly speaking, this project is an expression of my investment in understanding and exploring the lives of non-elite actors. Non-elite Southerners, both Black and white, were not merely passive recipients of racial ideologies from elites, but played active roles in the process of race-making. And I seek to understand how structural shifts, such as the modernization of grocery stores, prompted Southerners to reimagine the role and function of race, gender, and work in their everyday lives. Ultimately, my work reminds me that the way we choose to live our lives, our daily routines and rituals matter and have implications beyond what we can understand from our vantage point in the present. And I am honored to introduce the newly minted Dr. Esha Shirley, who comes to us from the History Department of the University of Michigan.
Good evening, everyone. As Micah just said, oh, sorry, I didn't give you a chance. Good evening. Good evening. said, my name is Esha Shirley. I am a first-year postdoctoral fellow here at the Woodson, and yes, a newly minted PhD. We're going to talk a little bit about the project I just finished, and I'm going to keep it brief because I'm between you and the lovely food we have outside. So I'll just start by saying that my project, Karen Crisis, Black Women and the Politics of Labor in Atlanta from 1968 to 1982, began actually when I was an undergraduate student organizer at Yale University, interested in urban history and transportation history, and not thinking I was quite so interested in the history of the US South. I learned that I was quite wrong about that, and the South is where it's at, where all the fun history happens. And as a part of a project I was doing about the development of regional rapid transit in Atlanta in the early 1970s, I was reading all these papers about what white elites were saying about how MARTA would make Atlanta a world-class city, what Black middle-class activists were saying about how making sure that Black workers and Black folks in the city got what they needed out of MARTA would also make Atlanta a world-class city. And in the midst of that discussion, I learned of a woman named Dorothy Bolden, who intervened in both sides of that conversation to say, that's great for y'all, but what about working class and poor Black people in the city who don't just need transportation because it makes this city world-class, but because they need to get to work, they need to come home, they need to take their children to their appointments, they need to go to the hospital. How do we rethink transportation as an infrastructure that brings together the care needs of the people of the city of Atlanta and not just the economic needs or the labor needs of middle-class folks who were jockeying for power in the city in the early 1970s. And so what I didn't know as an undergraduate, but I learned as a graduate student, is that Dorothy Bolden wasn't alone. She was a part of a network of Black women, of working class and poor Black women in Atlanta who are organizing across different sectors thinking about care and trying to transform the infrastructure of the city from one focused on growth to one focused on caring for themselves and their communities. And so I just want to talk briefly about sort of 3 different layers of that broader project that kind of overlap each other in the dissertation. And that first layer is about the story that many of us know about Atlanta, about the rise of Black political power, the emergence of the Black Mecca, and in that story, Black women like Dorothy Bolden are seen as kind of side characters. They're a part of the broader Black coalition that brings someone like Maynard Jackson to power in the early 1970s, but they don't have their own agenda. They're there to help other people. In my story, these are the central actors, and in one of my chapters, I call them a coalition within a coalition. That these working class and poor Black women had their own ideas about what Black political power should look like in the city of Atlanta, and were actually an independent base of political power that folks like Maynard Jackson had to court if they wanted to make progress in the city of Atlanta and be elected. A second sort of layer of that story is about what did they do with that political power once they had it. It wasn't just about voting or electoral power. These women were also interested in the fundamental structures that made the city run. So one of my favorite chapters in the dissertation went back to my early research on buses and shows how by organizing across different sectors in the city, they were able to, one of their major wins was to make sure that the fare stayed at 15 cents for at least 5 years so that it was actually accessible for people to use to get around the city. One of the interventions in that layer of the dissertation is around how we think about Black women's organizing at the city level. There's a lot of really wonderful work that I love that's about Black women in domestic labor in Atlanta by, of course, Sarah Hunter, people like Pramila Madison. There's great work about Black women in tenants unions and what they're doing there in the early 1970s. And of course, other great work about Black women doing activism in the city. And so one of my interventions is to say, actually we need to think about these different sectors together, and that what brings them together is the focus on care as the thing that ties them together. So the third layer of the project thinks about what this tells us actually about the history of capitalism at this moment. So at the same time that these struggles are happening at the municipal level of Atlanta about Black political power, there is a transformation happening at the national level about the structure of caregiving in the United States. And so these women were actually at the cutting edge of thinking about how to make sure Black women in particular got their just due as these transformations happened. And one example of that is that there started to be a move away from individual domestic workers working in folks' homes and towards team cleaning by like organizations. And so domestic worker unions would try and set up individual Black women so they could run their own team cleaning operations and not just end up being employees again for folks who are running these kinds of organizations. And so where I want to end is with a brief story where my dissertation ends, which is about where this research that's mostly in the 1970s and a little bit into the early 80s, where it takes us. And so some of you may have heard about the National Black Women's Health Project. I see a lot of nods, and Billy Avery. And so when they came to Atlanta in the early 1980s, Avery and her later partner, Gina Lithcott, asked around and said, who can we work with in working class Black communities who care about health? And they got some suggestions, and a few people told Lithcott, you know, there are some places you could go, but the one place you shouldn't go is Carver Homes. There's nothing there, there's no infrastructure, no one has ever done any work in that community that you could build on with the National Black Women's Health Project. And Lithcott thought, that sounds like a challenge. I should go there anyway, let me go and see what's going on. And so Lithcott went to Carver Homes and she met Louise Watley, who's one of the main organizers in the network in my story, who had organized rent strikes across the city of Atlanta in the early 1970s, who was a long-time political player and organizer, and she learned the story that my dissertation hopes to teach us, which is that working class Black women in the city have been creating the foundation for the ways that we think about care, reproductive justice, and organizing for a very long time. So with that, I'll end, and maybe pass it back to Dr. Benson.
Okay, now I'm the person between you and the food, so I'll be very quick. So you've got the 5 minute synopses. I hope we'll go out and get to know each other even better. I wanted to share what's next, what happens next. So as I mentioned earlier, this kicks off the fellowship workshop season. So beginning next week, we begin with workshops. Some of you may or may not be familiar with what actually happens. So the guest interlocutor, that term has been thrown out. And what that means is that scholars here get to choose leading scholars in their area from across the country who workshop their chapters, so which are pre-circulated 2 weeks in advance. And the guest interlocutor comes, engages those chapters. There's a chance to go to dinner or to lunch and to have one-on-one time with that guest interlocutor. And all the fellows and the director and the associate director read carefully and offer feedback. So the workshops are the heart. And that's where all this generative feedback comes. And so that everyone gets a shot at that. What also happens throughout the year are job market workshops. The how-tos of working through the job market, how-tos on manuscripts workshops. So here Beth Cologne, one of the acquisition editors for Africana Studies here at UVA Press, is here. And a range of formal and informal mentoring opportunities, and just to make sure that folk are okay, that you're okay. But that's what happens throughout the year. We do that for each other as a community. And so that's what happens throughout the year. As Alexi mentioned, there will be an announcement soon about the 8 lecturers coming through the African Studies Colloquium series. And know too, and you'll get announcements about this. You'll get announcements that the Woodson is also hosting the annual conference for the African American Intellectual History Society. Many of us know the Black Perspectives blog is very popular. They'll be here March 7th and 8th. I know many of us have already put in panels and papers to present. So you'll hear more about that, but I just wanted to mention it now. Okay, no more talking. Let's eat. Let's eat.